In a crowd of 600,000 people at Isle of Wight festival, two guitarists made brief eye contact. Jimi Hendrix on stage, performing for what would be his last UK concert. Jimmy Page in the audience, one face among hundreds of thousands. The moment lasted maybe 2 seconds. Jimmy looked directly at Jimmy. Not the showman's sweep across the crowd, but actual recognition, connection. Jimmy wanted to believe it was acknowledgement, maybe even farewell, but that felt too dramatic, too final. Except it was final. 18 days later, Jimmy was dead, and that 2-second moment of eye contact became the last conversation they never had. August 30th, 1970. The Isle of Wight Festival was the largest rock festival ever attempted in the UK, bigger than Woodstock in terms of attendance. 600,000 people descended on a small island off England's south coast to see what organizers promised would be the last great festival. The lineup was extraordinary. The Who, The Doors, Joni Mitchell, Miles Davis, Joan Baez, Leonard Cohen. But for many, including Jimi Page, there was one name that mattered above all others: Jimi Hendrix. Jimmy had been following Jimmy's career with intense interest since that first meeting at the Bag of Nails in 1966. 4 years of watching Jimmy revolutionize guitar playing, of competing with him in the amp wars, of learning from him even when they were barely speaking. 4 years that had transformed both of their careers and the entire landscape of rock guitar. Led Zeppelin had exploded since Jimmy formed the band in 1968. They were now one of the biggest rock bands in the world. But Jimmy never forgot that watching Jimmy play had been the catalyst for much of Led Zeppelin's experimental approach, their willingness to push boundaries, their conviction that the guitar could be more than a traditional rock instrument. When Jimmy heard Jimmy was performing at Isle of Wight, he knew he had to be there. Not to perform, Led Zeppelin wasn't on the bill, just to watch, to see what Jimmy was doing now, what new territories he was exploring. Jimmy arrived at the festival site on August 29th, the day before Jimmy's scheduled performance. The scene was chaotic. 600,000 people camping in fields, inadequate facilities, organizational problems. The festival that was supposed to be a triumph of counterculture was becoming a nightmare of logistics. But Jimmy wasn't there for the festival experience. He was there for one performance. Jimmy was scheduled to perform on Sunday night, August 30th. Originally planned for midnight, but the festival was running hours behind schedule. By the time Jimmy finally took the stage, it was after 2 a.m. on Monday morning. Jimmy positioned himself in the crowd where he could see the stage clearly. Even in a crowd of 600,000, Jimmy knew how to find the right spot. Not front row where the crush would be unbearable, but close enough to see Jimmy's expressions, his fingers on the fretboard, the subtle physical cues that revealed what he was thinking. The wait felt endless. Delays, technical problems, other acts running over their time. Jimmy stood in the crowd, patient but increasingly concerned. Rumors were circulating that Jimmy was exhausted, that he'd been difficult during rehearsals, that he didn't want to perform at all. Finally, after 2 a.m., Jimmy walked on stage. The crowd erupted, 600,000 people cheering. Even after hours of waiting in uncomfortable conditions, the sight of Jimi Hendrix with his guitar was enough to energize the massive audience. But Jimmy, watching carefully, saw something the crowd didn't see. Or maybe they saw it but didn't recognize what it meant. Jimmy looked tired, not just physically tired from the late hour, though he was certainly that, but tired in a deeper way, spiritually exhausted. Like someone who'd been running on empty for too long and finally hit the wall. His movements as he approached the microphone were slower than Jimmy remembered. His usual stage presence, that electric charisma that could fill a stadium, seemed muted. He was there, but not entirely there. Jimmy started with God Save the Queen, his version of the British national anthem, heavy with distortion and irony. The crowd loved it, but Jimi noticed Jimi's playing was mechanical. Technically perfect, Jimi could play these riffs in his sleep, but lacking the spontaneous fire that usually characterized his performances. 3 songs in, during Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, something shifted. Jimi seemed to settle into the performance, finding his groove. The music became more alive, more present. This was the Jimi that Jimi knew. That's when it happened. Jimi was in the middle of a guitar solo, his fingers dancing across the fretboard with that impossible fluidity that had always mesmerized Jimi. The stage lights swept across the massive crowd, illuminating hundreds of thousands of faces. And for just a moment, maybe 2 seconds or less, Jimi's eyes found Jimi's. In a crowd of 600,000 people, this should have been impossible. The odds of direct eye contact, of mutual recognition, were astronomical. But it happened. Jimi's gaze locked with Jimi's. Not the general sweep of eyes across an audience that every performer does, not the vague acknowledgement of crowd presence, but specific, direct, personal recognition. Jimi felt it like a physical impact, that moment of connection in the chaos. Jimi's expression didn't change much, a slight nod maybe, or perhaps Jimi imagined that. The whole moment was so brief that later Jimi would question whether he'd really seen what he thought he'd seen. But in the moment, Jimi was certain. Jimi knew he was there. Jimi saw him. Jimi acknowledged him. And there was something in that look, something Jimi couldn't quite name. Not sadness exactly, not even weariness, though that was part of it. Something more like resolution, like someone who'd made a decision and was at peace with it, even if the decision was difficult. The moment passed. Jimi's eyes moved on, continuing the sweep across the crowd. The guitar solo continued, the song continued, the festival continued. But Jimi stood frozen, trying to process what he'd felt in that brief connection. He wanted to believe it was just acknowledgement, Jimi recognizing a fellow guitarist in the crowd, a mutual respect between peers. That made sense. That was reasonable. But something deeper whispered that this was more, that the look in Jimi's eyes had been farewell. And that thought felt absurd, dramatic, too much meaning assigned to a 2-second glance. Jimi tried to shake it off, to focus on the rest of the performance. The show continued for another hour. Jimi played Purple Haze, Voodoo Child, All Along the Watchtower. The technical brilliance was there. Moments of transcendence broke through, but overall there was a weight to the performance that Jimi had never felt before at a Jimi Hendrix show. Other people in the crowd didn't seem to notice. They were ecstatic. This was Jimi Hendrix, the guitar god, playing for them at what was being called the last great festival. They were witnessing history. But Jimi, who knew Jimi's playing intimately from years of study and competition, heard something else. He heard someone going through the motions, someone technically perfect but emotionally elsewhere, someone performing out of obligation rather than joy. During Voodoo Child, Jimi's most physically demanding song, Jimi watched his face. Jimi's eyes were often closed, lost in the music the way they always were during intense passages, but when they opened, there was a distance in them, like he was looking at something far away, something the audience couldn't see. Jimi thought about approaching Jimi after the show, going backstage, asking if he was okay, maybe suggesting they grab a drink and talk about music, about life, about where they were both heading. They'd never been close friends. Their relationship was more like rival siblings who respected each other from a distance. But in that moment, Jimi felt a pull to bridge that distance. The performance ended around 3:30 a.m. Jimi walked off stage to massive applause. 600,000 people on their feet, cheering for a performance most of them thought was extraordinary. Jimi hesitated. Should he try to get backstage? Would Jimi even want to see him? What would he say?
"Hey, I was worried about you based on a 2-second look we shared during your set," sounded ridiculous even in Jimmy's head. So he didn't go. He walked away, through the massive crowd, back to where he'd parked. He told himself he was being overdramatic. Jimmy was fine, tired from the late hour and the touring schedule, but fine. The weight Jimmy had sensed was probably just his imagination projected onto a performance because Jimmy himself was feeling reflective about his own career, his own path. The Isle of Wight festival concluded. The crowds dispersed. News reports focused on the organizational problems, the size of the audience, the various performances. Jimmy's set was reviewed as solid but not spectacular. Some critics noted he seemed subdued. Most assumed he was just tired. Jimmy went back to his life. Led Zeppelin was in the middle of massive success. There were tours to plan, albums to record, the constant forward momentum of being in the world's biggest rock band. 18 days passed. September 18th, 1970. Jimmy was at home when the phone call came. A friend from the music scene, voice shaky. "Have you heard about Jimmy?" Jimmy's stomach dropped before he even heard the words. "He's dead. Jimi Hendrix is dead. They found him in London this morning." The details came in fragments over the following hours and days. An apartment in Notting Hill, barbiturates, choking on vomit, dead at 27 years old. One of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, gone.
Jimmy sat in his house, unable to process it. Jimmy was supposed to be eternal. Jimmy was the guitar god, the revolutionary, the one who changed everything. People like that weren't supposed to die, especially not at 27. But Jimmy had died. And Jimmy's mind immediately went back to Isle of Wight, to that performance 18 days ago, to the weight he'd sensed, to that 2-second moment of eye contact. Had Jimmy known? Not consciously, perhaps, but had some part of him understood that this was the end? That the Isle of Wight performance would be his last in the UK? The country that had discovered him and given him his first real success? Was that look, that brief moment of connection, Jimmy's way of saying goodbye to the guitar community that had shaped him, represented by Jimmy and the crowd? Or was Jimmy projecting meaning onto a random glance because the human mind can't handle the randomness of death, so it creates narratives, finds patterns, assigns significance to moments that were just moments? Jimmy didn't know, would never know. What he did know was this. In a crowd of 600,000 people, Jimmy had looked directly at him, had recognized him, had acknowledged him, and 18 days later, Jimmy was gone. The funeral was in Seattle, Jimmy's hometown. Jimmy didn't attend. He wanted to, felt he should, but ultimately couldn't bring himself to go. What would he say? What would his presence mean? He and Jimmy had never been close friends, just rivals and mutual admirers from a distance. Instead, Jimmy mourned privately. He sat with his guitar and tried to play some of Jimmy's songs, but couldn't make it through them. His fingers knew the notes, but he couldn't capture the feeling. That was always the thing with Jimmy. You could learn his techniques, but you couldn't learn whatever made those techniques transcendent. In interviews over the following months, Jimmy was careful when talking about Jimmy. He didn't want to claim a friendship they'd never had, didn't want to exploit Jimmy's death for his own profile. But he also felt a need to acknowledge what Jimmy had meant to him, to his music, to everyone who'd picked up a guitar in the last 5 years. "Jimmy showed us what was possible," Jimmy told one interviewer. "Not just technically, though his technique was extraordinary, but philosophically. He showed us that the guitar didn't have limits except the ones we imposed on it ourselves." What Jimmy didn't mention in interviews was the Isle of Wight show, the feeling of something being wrong, the moment of eye contact, the sense of farewell he'd felt but dismissed. He kept that to himself for years. Eventually, decades later, when enough time had passed that the memory had softened into something he could examine without the sharp edges cutting too deep,
Jimi talked about it with close friends. "I knew something was wrong," he'd say. "When I saw him at Isle of Wight, I knew. I didn't know what exactly, didn't know he was going to die, but I knew something had changed, something had shifted. And that moment when our eyes met, I'll carry that for the rest of my life." 2 seconds in a crowd of 600,000 people. But it felt like a conversation, like he was telling me something I wasn't ready to hear. Friends would ask if Jimi regretted not going backstage after the show, not trying to talk to Jimi, not somehow intervening in whatever was happening.
Jimmy's answer was always the same. "I don't know if I could have changed anything. Probably not. Jimi was on a path, and I was just an observer, but I wish I'd tried. I wish I'd at least said goodbye properly, instead of this 2-second look that I've spent 50 years trying to interpret." The Isle of Wight performance became legendary for reasons no one anticipated, not because it was Jimmy's best show. It wasn't. Not because it was revolutionary. It was solid, but not groundbreaking. But because it was the last, the final time Jimi Hendrix performed in the UK. The goodbye nobody knew they were witnessing. Jimi kept playing guitar. Led Zeppelin continued to massive success. Jimmy's career spanned decades, multiple bands, countless performances, but he never forgot that Isle of Wight night, never forgot standing in a crowd of 600,000 people and having Jimi Hendrix's eyes find his for 2 impossible seconds. In those 2 seconds, Jimi received something, whether it was acknowledgement, farewell, warning, or just a random glance that Jimmy's mind has elevated to significance over the decades. He still doesn't know. What he knows is that Jimi Hendrix changed his life, that watching Jimi play made Jimi a better guitarist, a braver artist, a more thoughtful musician, that the competition between them pushed both of them to explore territories they might not have reached alone. And that on August 30th, 1970, in a crowd of 600,000 people, 2 guitarists had their last moment of connection. One on stage, 18 days from death. One in the audience, about to spend the rest of his life wishing he'd understood what that moment meant. If this story about connection, loss, and the conversations we wish we'd had moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who understands the weight of moments we only recognize as significant after they've passed. Have you ever had a final moment with someone without knowing it would be the last? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to turn on notifications for more untold stories about the human moments behind music's greatest legends.